And so we will be recording this webinar and sending that out as soon as we are able afterwards. I know that it is super early for some of the people who registered in the West Coast. So if you are here from the West Coast, we appreciate you taking time this early in the morning. And if not, they're probably waiting for this recording. First off, I will introduce myself. I am Elle Covington, and I am at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm an evidence synthesis librarian, but I am a member of the ACRL EBSS Social Work Committee. And I am here with the rest of the Social Work Committee. We are happy that we are able to put on this webinar. It is going to be, well, I have a slide for this. Let me go ahead and pop that over here. If you would like to learn more about who we are, we've got a link here. But generally, we are here to provide support for social work liaisons as our main target audience. But of course, we are so happy that we have the capacity to put on things like this for a much broader audience as well. So welcome to everyone here. Social work librarian or not, we are very glad that you were able to join us. I'm going to introduce our panelists or have them introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about this webinar and what we're hoping to do today. So we are using the definition of gray literature from the National Library of Medicine, which is information produced on all levels of government, academia, business, and industry in electronic and print formats that are not controlled by commercial publishing. And of course, that includes a lot of government data on government websites that are being taken down with the current administration. It also includes government-controlled databases like ERIC and PubMed. And so ERIC, as many of you, I'm sure, are already aware, has announced some cuts. And I think we don't have final word on that. Hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then there's also rumblings about PubMed as well. And those are two very important sources of gray literature. So we thought that it would be great to talk today about, what are some strategies? How can we weather this storm when things are disappearing and things are unsure? We are sort of coming from, as I said, we're the social work committee. So we're coming from a little bit of a social sciences perspective on this. And we are sort of coming from the idea of scoping reviews, systematic reviews, other advanced reviews that really rely heavily on gray literature to help with publication bias, right? To mitigate publication bias in, the knowledge base and, the things that these types of advanced reviews do, which is, inform future research, policy and practice, very important for those kinds of things. That said, we hope that this is going to be very broadly applicable beyond just the social sciences and, beyond scoping and systematic reviews. But that's just a little bit of the way that we've sort of framed this for our panelists today. And so what we're going to do is we do have the Q&A and the chat. And so we would ask everybody to, if you have questions for our panelists, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. We'll be handling both, but we'll be really pulling those questions from the Q&A towards the end. I'm going to start by, like I said, introducing our panelists, but then also we've got 3 or 4 questions that we informed them in advance that we were going to be asking them to get the conversation started. And then after we've gotten through those questions, then we will open it up for those audience questions at the end. So feel free to pop those in the Q&A at any time, and we will prioritize and try to, get as many of those as possible towards the end. All right, and I see that we've got chat going great, so please continue to have great conversations in the chat. I'm presenting, so I probably won't be able to see that, but like I said, we've got a whole committee behind this. I'm just the face and the voice on the screen at the moment, but there's lots of people who are going to be able to handle that chat and those Q&A. So definitely keep those coming. So with that, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to go ahead and start. Top of my list is Briana last. So Briana, if you could introduce yourself and let us know who you are, what you do, your background, and sort of how that all relates to gray literature.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Elle. And so great to see such a wonderful number of people attending this, especially the ones that are on the West Coast. So I'm Briana Last. I'm an assistant professor at Stony Brook University in New York in the Department of Psychology. And as my introduction says, I'm a behavioral health services and policy researcher. So I really study how systems, particularly policies, impact mental health service systems and mental health service outcomes. And so I have done several scoping and systematic reviews in my career thus far, and I've worked really closely with librarians through all of those experiences and have learned a lot through that. And so I'm just really excited to talk and be in an audience of librarians. It's very exciting. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being here. And then second on my list is Sarah. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sarah Bonato. I'm a librarian at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Ontario, and I've also authored a book on searching the gray literature. But I just want to add that from the behavioral health perspective, specifically in the addictions field, gray literature is really essential for the dissemination of information because often many practices, the knowledge is first disseminated in the gray literature and then the published literature at a later date. One example of this would be safer injection sites and also safe prescribing. And often there's much more information in the gray literature than there is in the published literature. And the literature instance would be reports from community agencies, toolkits, and also reports from policy producing organizations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much for being here. And last but definitely not least, Erin Pollard, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Erin Pollard. I am going to be speaking in my personal capacity today, but up until March, for the past 12 to 14 years, depending on the program, I've been the project officer for ERIC, which is a large database of education research in the U.S. Department of Education. In addition, I was a project officer for What Works Clearinghouse, which did systematic reviews of different policies, programs, and curricula to help figure out which worked and which did not. And it relied very heavily on the gray literature base. So I hope to talk to you about some of the stuff that has been happening on the government side.
Awesome. Thanks. We're so glad that all three of you were able to join us today and answer some of our burning questions about gray literature and how we're going to handle this, especially in the times that we are in currently. So I'll go ahead and jump us into our first question here. Oh, and as a reminder, I mentioned this already, but go ahead, pop those questions that you have for our panelists into Q&A, and we will address those towards the end. But our first question for our panelists, why is gray literature important for secondary research? And like I said, we're sort of couching this in scoping reviews, but definitely feel free to expand beyond that. So can you give any examples of how gray literature may have made a difference in the outcome of a review? And to answer, let's go ahead and go in the same order that we just introduced. And I'll let you go for it, Briana. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elle. Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, I think as you mentioned, Elle, publication bias obviously is a huge factor in scoping reviews, which is, the tendency for positive findings to be published, sometimes called the kind of file drawer problem. So sometimes it's at the sort of researcher level, but also sometimes it's at the journal level. But, for me, because I do a lot of work in the kind of policy space, a lot of the work that I'm interested in isn't necessarily endeavored by people who are necessarily looking to publish in peer-reviewed journals or get IRB approval. A lot of the times, a lot of the work that I do is looking at kind of program evaluations, of policies, or implementation initiatives. And so that work has never been designed for kind of peer review. It often is designed to really get a sense of like, what was the effectiveness of this policy? What did implementation look like? And that work is often published in sort of white papers or reports. And so a scoping review that I did with the librarian at Stony Brook, who is Laurel, who's here, we actually did a scoping review looking at federal loan repayment programs for the behavioral health workforce. And the majority of the literature was actually gray literature. So there had been very little scientific work actually evaluating these programs and whether or not they improved recruitment and retention of the behavioral health workforce, but there was a ton of policy literature. And it was extremely rigorous literature. It just was designed for the purpose of policymakers, for them to be able to know, like, okay, is this policy that we implemented working? Is this program working? And so that's been a lot of my work. The other way in which I've used gray literature is I've also been undergoing a systematic review of so-called conversion therapies. So, change efforts by practitioners who want to change the gender identity or sexual orientation of people. And, a lot of that work has been done by international organizations, by nonprofits, by think tanks. I'm thinking about like the Williams Institute and the Trevor Project. Those are all, organizations that have lots of researchers employed for them, and are doing really, really highly rigorous work, but they're not necessarily publishing it for the scientific community. They're publishing it to disseminate really broadly. So that's kind of the two domains of research that I've done where I've really relied heavily on the gray literature, and it's been instrumental in the work that I've done.
Great. Should I just jump in next, or are we, is that the
Absolutely,
order?
go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I would say, second Brianna's points, but also specifically, there was one review that I did on early stage cannabis regulatory policy across Canada's four largest provinces, and that was in 2019. And without the gray literature, we would have not have any content really to have published the review, simply because simply because essentially different associations such as the BC Association of Pharmacists, the Registered Nurses of Ontario, the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, they were all creating and disseminating position papers on the decriminalization of cannabis. And so for our review, we did a search of the published literature, but then we had to check for web content, reports, policy documents to really find the information of the evolving provincial cannabis legal frameworks. So it was basically the absence of A, peer-reviewed studies, but then also B, it was that geographical focus. And often I find if you are looking for specifically geographical information, specifically, say, on homeless populations or on First Nation populations here in Canada, you really have to look towards the gray literature, and you also have to look towards that geographical specific region too.
Yeah. So I have more experience doing systematic reviews, which are a little more narrow and tailored, but we would see similar things that when we being the What Works Clearinghouse is going out to try to find all the evidence on what works to help a student learn how to read in third grade, or does this specific program work? You might have a journal article, but that journal article would have involved students who were in the classroom that experiment, because of the length of time for publication would be 5-6 years ago, and the program will have changed and evolved. So when we were looking for cutting edge research, what is most recent, what is most relevant, what is most impactful, we typically found that the developers, those people who were trying to sell the intervention, they would be publishing the results of their findings in a glossy 1-pager or 2-pager on their website, and that would be incredibly up to date. They sometimes might finish data collection in August, or I guess it would be June, and it would be out by August. We also found that our grantees, when we funded them to do an evaluation of a program, they weren't necessarily publishing in journals. Part of that was to get around public access requirements that would require them to pay to be open access. They didn't have the funding to do that. So they would be publishing these papers, and I use publishing loosely, where they might write them and they would just sit on someone's file server, and they would not even be in the traditional public part that was required for great literature. And so we would work to get these into ERIC, because again, these were causal studies that just were not, they had no interest in putting them in a journal. They had no interest in sharing that information out, because they were using that information to help improve the program. And lastly, because of publication bias, we typically would see that we weren't going to find any null or negative findings in a journal. That just very, very rarely happens. I can count the number of times that we've seen that in one hand, but you would be more likely to see it in a dissertation, which would not formally be published. And part of the reason why we would expect that we would see this is that null findings aren't exciting, but those null findings are really helpful when you're trying to figure out what that impact of a program is. Because if you have that one study that gets into a journal that shows that this improves student learning, then you have 10 studies that show, well, actually it doesn't. It makes no difference. Teachers and principals were using the information from the journal without realizing that the majority of the evidence actually show that it has no effect, which is not inspiring, but is helpful for them trying to figure out what programs to invest in.
Absolutely. And that's why that's so important. I mean, that's like the purpose of systematic and scoping reviews, right? Is to find that best evidence. And then if you're not looking at the null results, those other things, like how are you going to find that best evidence? Thanks for that. So let's go ahead and jump into the next question, is how do you approach searching for great literature, and how can librarians and researchers collaborate on that process? And let's shake it up this time. Let's start with Sarah, and then we'll do Erin and Briana. How does that sound?
Great. Okay, so when I am working with researchers, I always remind myself that while librarians are often the experts on having a systematic search, making sure that a search is consistent and reproducible, researchers are indeed the ones who are the subject experts. So I always collaborate with researchers on having them tell me where they think the most valuable gray literature will be. So if they would think preprints are going to be a key source, or if they are or if they think that policy documents are going to be more relevant, I always ask researchers if we should search specific organizations, and also what organizations, would comprise the list. And another way that I collaborate with researchers is asking them about the data saturation, because gray literature searches, they can be endless, and you really do have to have scope management techniques in place before you start searching. So what I do is that I talk to them about where the most relevant information is going to be available, and then I offer my insights. So one example of this is we were looking at a forensic population and that would be psychiatric patients who are involved with the criminal justice system. And we wanted to look at information from the States and the US and also Canada, but the US is very, very large. So what we did is that we decided to look at information from the states with the largest populations and look at information from the US states with the largest level of, highest level of prison involved populations. And so we limited our gray literature search to those specific regions. And then also, thankfully, there aren't as many Canadian provinces, so we could look at all the information from the Canadian provinces. However, how I approach searching the gray literature is that in order to get the optimal data saturation, I try not to limit myself to simply one source. So I try to use a multiple of sources. So, for example, I would use multiple preprint servers if I was looking for preprints. Additionally, if I was doing a web search, I would do a Google search, but then I would also try to look from information from different geographical regions, such as the UK. And then I would also try to supplement that with additional research tool like Million Short or DuckDuckGo, just to see how my results would vary. And then that way I'm getting a more diverse content instead of relying just on one search source.
So, I realize that there are 430 some, mostly librarians on the call, and I'm going to preface that I am not a librarian when I say this. And my goal is to help save taxpayer money. So I realize what I'm going to say might sound a little bit sacrilege. But when we were looking at our approach to do systematic reviews, the big question I would always ask my team of librarians and researchers is, how important is it to get every possible piece of information, and how important is it that you have the most current information versus how big of a deal is it that your information is 6 months out of date? Why I ask that is that often when I would see an approach to searching for the gray literature, our amazing team of librarians that we would work with would go out and manually search a couple hundred websites, policy organizations, and think tanks, and all these places that produce amazing gray lit that were also indexed in ERIC. But they're indexed in ERIC every 6 months, meaning that there is going to be a bit of a delay, not a year delay normally, but at most 6 months delay. So what I would often suggest my team do is that first you do a search in ERIC, because in education, that is going to get you 95% of the way there. And then you will redo that search with a date added field at the very end, just to make sure you didn't miss anything new. The second thing I recommend doing is going to the researchers doing that field with your list of, these are the studies we found, and say, what's missing, who are the big people? And often the researchers who were guiding our systematic reviews would be able to name 3 or 4 names. Go to those people's ORCID pages and LinkedIn pages, because that is where we would see the most discussion, the most sharing, and we get a lot of the very recent information. And that would enable us to kind of efficiently get a search, because what we were finding is that when people were just going to these websites and doing a more manual approach, they were missing things because their websites were horribly designed and it was just taking so much longer. So it's a bit unorthodox, but those are the big strategies that we have found to get the most high quality information in as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Sarah and Erin shared. I think 2 pieces of, like, being a content expert is so key. Like, and if you are not, then really having a team, that is, and consulting with lots of researchers. So oftentimes before I do a systematic review, even if or a scoping review, even if I'm very familiar with the literature, I still do a lot of consultation with experts on the area to make sure that I'm, conceptualizing the search in a way that is generalizable or that feels, accurate, as well as, really understanding, in the kind of Cochrane manual, like PICO form, if you're doing like a systematic review, like, what is precisely the intervention that I'm studying? What is the population? And getting lots of feedback on that. So I think content knowledge is so key. And then once you have a really good grip on the content, then working really collaboratively with librarians to figure out, okay, I know where I want to search generally. How am I going to optimize this search strategy? And so I think it's really important to take seriously these reviews, because reviews are highly cited relative to, individual papers, and then oftentimes the sort of findings of reviews get really reified. And, the reality is that, as Erin shared, research is constantly evolving. And one dynamic that's really prevalent in particular, I'm sure it's all literature, but, particularly health science literature, is that oftentimes when there's a new idea, there's lots of early research that's often underpowered. So it means there's not enough statistical power to really demonstrate an effect with small samples, because there's a lot of excitement about the novelty of the area. So, I'm already seeing that a lot with AI studies, where the sample sizes are tiny, and it's there's all this research being published on AI and all of its potential. And you're seeing the sample sizes and you're thinking, how much can we conclude from this research? And then what happens is, after that sort of huge hype bubble, then there are much larger, more rigorous studies that are published after the fact that are much more circumspect about whatever the intervention is or innovation. And so sometimes a systematic review is published sort of in the interim, where it's sort of mainly based on the early research. And so it's not a comprehensive analysis of the more robust literature. And this actually happened to me somewhat. So I did, when I was in graduate school, a systematic review on nudges, which are basically these kind of light touch interventions. And then a group of researchers a couple of years ago did a review of the literature, and they did a comparison of the published literature and then the literature that was undertaken by governmental groups that had done nudges. And they did a really sophisticated comparison of the effect sizes of the academic literature and the literature within the kind of policy space. And they found much smaller effect sizes in the policy space from governments. And they said that 70% of the difference was accounted for by publication bias and the lack of statistical power. I'll put the study in the chat. So it really shows you that it's so important to look at this gray literature, because without that gray literature, you're going to be really overestimating effect sizes for an intervention, particularly if you're sort of in the early stages of the literature.
So that's so interesting. Thank you. So our next question, and I'm very interested to hear this, especially with all of the examples that you all just shared. So you can either use those examples again, how would you do this differently, or something else? But so the question for you, how would you do these gray literature searches? We'll broaden it out differently in June 2025 compared to January 2025, right? We just talked about how much has changed. And then also, just to complicate the question a little bit more, how would you justify the importance of inclusion of gray literature as it becomes harder to access? And let's change it up once more. Let's start with Erin this time. We'll do Briana and Sarah.
Okay, so for those of you, I'm going to give a recap of what has happened in the field of education research since February, just to make sure everyone is on the same page, because I have noticed that the media has not gotten entirely accurate. In January 2025, education research was incredibly strong, and there was lots and lots of work funded by the Department of Education and others. In February, about $1 billion worth of grants or of contracts were canceled in education research. What does that mean? It means that many of the top education researchers are now unemployed. And then in March, they came in and they, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, laid off about 90% of the Institute of Education Sciences, including me, or in the process. It's in the courts right now. So where are we as a field today, and how does that impact? ERIC still exists at a 50% capacity. They're indexing about 50% of the education research that they were in January. They have not been able to publish it to the website because they fired the people that did it. I'm optimistic that the team will figure it out. or that the courts will order us back, and so we can get the research published. So with that context of what is going on right now in education research, I know that there is not as much education research being published, because when you look at the big firms who are doing the best studies, the Mathematica, the AIR, the Apt Associates, they have had massive layoffs. Those people are no longer working there and publishing those studies. So that research is missing. We also know that half of the content in ERIC, roughly 45%, is no longer being indexed because of funding cuts imposed by the Department of Government Efficiency. So, all right, so with that context, what would I do? The first thing I would do is, because ERIC isn't being updated, that also means that Google Scholarly, and some scholarly databases are not being updated either. They rely on ERIC's metadata. So just Googling it is not going to be as effective as it used to be. I would then say I would get on LinkedIn. Why? Because my LinkedIn, which is different than your LinkedIn, has all of the researchers who are looking for work and are talking about the work that they were doing, and they're finishing up the work on their own. I would try to get conference papers, because if the conferences were funded prior to January, the researchers still might be allowed to go, and they're still trying to go to try to have this. You might get to see some research there. What I would realistically do is just acknowledge that there is going to be research lost. We had studies in the field. Some studies were like 8-9 years of studies, and those data are lost. And so I think that part of it is you have to acknowledge the elephant. And oftentimes I find that people are very quick to try to find solutions, and just know that there's going to be this huge gap in evidence. And so I would use a traditional path, acknowledge that right now there's not going to be as much information, and the newer research might be bad. And then really look to preprint servers, white papers, conference papers. And the last thing I would say is that as an education field, I have been pushing people to put their papers in ERIC as online submissions. Regardless of where they were going to publish it, just get it into ERIC. And we've incentivized them to do that. But now that ERIC is those will get into ERIC eventually once they can figure out how to do the publish. But that means that right now, a lot of those papers will come out eventually, but for this period of time, know that you're just not going to get everything, and be open about that. I realize that is not inspiring.
No, but it's very helpful and very important for us to know. And I feel like so much more for me to think about too. Like, I just had to write a methods section for a scoping review that we did, and had to acknowledge this is not replicable anymore because of all of these changes. So yeah, very important thing to talk about. Thank you. Yeah. Briana, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think, Erin, I appreciate you sharing all of that. I mean, it's just like a really horrific moment for science, for education, for knowledge production more broadly. I think both the gray literature and the published literature are deeply affected because research funding has been cut. Someone mentioned, I think Sarah or Erin, I can't remember, open access fees. Without grants, we can't publish a lot of our work, and increasingly journals are charging open access fees, and that hasn't changed since January. So there are a very limited number of journals where I can publish my research. And I don't have external grant funding. A lot of my grants have not been reviewed or have been kind of quietly archived. And so I'm facing a position right now where it's like, if the several journals that I want to actually publish my work in are not going to accept it, then like I'm not really sure where I can even put this work. And so I think, the entire field of science is challenged, and it's an iterative relationship between gray and published literature, because I think in general we're just going to experience a loss. One of the things that our group has done, so in addition to kind of a lot of scoping reviews and reviews more broadly, we do a lot of work using publicly available data sets that we integrate with primary data collection. And so our group has really struggled because we've tried to scramble to, download lots of publicly available data sets before they were sort of being disappeared. and rely on other teams of scientists and researchers who have done that work. And it's, it's such a tragedy because it took decades to build those extremely impressive data sets. And now the sort of clock has stopped on those. And so I think more broadly, we are all resilient and we'll figure out ways to keep doing a lot of this work. And at the same time, I totally agree with Erin that we have to acknowledge that knowledge is going to kind of have some gaping holes in it for the foreseeable future.
Awesome, thank you. And Sarah, I would love to hear too from you, especially on how you think you would search differently with the government websites, right? Since you've done a lot of work on that, and that's another thing that's changing. So I don't want to limit you in what you want to talk about, but that's something that personally I'm super interested in hearing from you.
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. So, I mean, as far as how I would search for a scoping review or any type of review differently in June 2025 compared to January 2025, I would say it also goes back to the discontinuation of the National Guidelines Clearinghouse in 2018. Eric is now a similar situation where if I was writing up a methodology for a systematic review or a scoping review, I would simply not. I mean, you can't include the National Guidelines Clearinghouse anymore, but I would also not include Eric simply because it was not being updated, and therefore I can't present it to the research team, it being a source of value as it was in the past, because I mean that's simply, the realistic that's simply the where it has landed. As far as searching from governmental websites, how it would change is that there would be two different. It doesn't change very much from the perspective of searching for information from the UK or Australia or Canada, which I often do. So this would be specifically to the United States. One, it would be the capture of information. So instead of just capturing information with a link to a report, it would actually be a hard capture. So that information would be specifically downloaded. If it was a PDF of a report, instead of just copying the link to an Excel spreadsheet, it would be downloading and saving the report. The other thing which I was always advocating before with the Greylit, but now a little bit more so, would be the critical appraisal of the gray literature that is available on a website, simply because if you go on to the Veterans Health Administration, a lot of the uh, a lot of the information on that website is is um is being tagged as concurrent with the values and the views of the current administration, which wasn't a tag that you would see in the past. So all gray literature should be critically appraised, but now it's a really good reminder that to critically appraise uh, very vigorously. And one I really use a lot I suggest is the ACONS checklist, which was created by a librarian in Australia, Jess Tyndall, and I'll put that link in the chat at the end of this panel.
Awesome, thanks so much. I feel like I have a whole new thing to worry about now, appraising gray literature. So it looks like we're okay on time, so I'm going to go ahead and ask this fourth question before I open it up to our audience questions. And that is, what do you anticipate for the future of gray literature? I guess we could do a free for all this time, since we've gone through the different orders.
I can take it first. So I think it will really vary discipline by discipline. And a lot of it is unknown. And so what I would say, if you asked me this in January, I would say that we were expecting to see a huge rise of gray literature because of public access requirements and article processing fees, that researchers could not afford to pay the article processing fees. So they were going to be publishing more in gray literature and saving, instead of having maybe 5 publications from a grant, they would have 1 in a journal and the rest being gray lit. So I think that you will continue to see that. I also think that you will, as funding becomes more challenging, if that trend continues, right? There is a lot of uncertainty right now. A lot of what is being talked about as final is not actually final yet. I would say that you will probably hopefully see smaller pockets of research coming out, but coming out in less traditional space, less peer review. But my hope is that this is more temporary and other organizations will come in and take over the role of some of those large producers of great literature in the past. And I'm also optimistic that while some government websites and government databases have been impacted a lot right now, that this may not be permanent, that a year from now, I'm not going to say we will get to the status quo, but that a year from now, what is happening today may not be permanent.
Optimism that this is a blip, not a feature going forward. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to see journals kind of put their money where their mouth is. I've seen a lot of journals, publish really amazing statements saying how much, academic freedom is under attack and that we really need to support science. And I would love for that to be like followed with a reduction in fees, even if it's temporary, because I think that would be really helpful. But if not, I think I agree with Erin that we might be seeing more great literature. I think the content of the literature is going to really change, because if people are losing funding for certain areas of research, that means that the literature is going to reflect that. And so I think that is something that, I'm really concerned about, is that what is consistent with the kind of current priorities are not necessarily consistent with what the scientific field thinks is important.
Okay, so I guess now I'm next. I think Erin and Brianna had some excellent points to make, so I'm not going to try to repeat what they said, but to maybe have find like a different a little bit of a different characteristic of Greylit to talk about. So, COVID-19, prior to COVID-19, preprints really, there was some debates about including preprints in medicine, and the big issue was the fact that it was preliminary research that had not been peer reviewed. And preprints were primarily historically more widely in use in engineering and software. And then COVID-19 came upon us, and preprints were the only way to really disseminate information quickly that would not be available otherwise, simply because of the way the situation was unfolding. There wasn't the time for journal submission and the peer reviewed, and you would never see preprints prior to COVID-19 being cited in a Cochrane review. So I anticipate that preprints perhaps will become building upon COVID-19. I anticipate perhaps that preprints will become more incorporated in our searches for the literature, for systematic and scoping reviews, simply because the information isn't available elsewhere. And so that is the one part that I am anticipating, and maybe I'm really hopeful, is that when now somebody says we will search Medline, PsycInfo, Embase, the usual suspects. I'm really anticipating and hoping that preprints become one of our usual suspects for a search source, rather than being on the, on the fringe as it was in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. All right. So, oh, sorry, Erin, you unmuted?
I was just gonna tag along to that prior up until January, I was working on a project on living evidence, which is the idea of continuously updating literature reviews. And this started as an idea, or I first heard about it with COVID. And then I was working with the Federation of American Scientists to try to figure out how can we bring this to the government for other things, for medicine, for other HHS programs, for education. And I think the rise of preprints and that shift is exactly what we need to happen in this field, in our field collectively, of recognizing that data can come from different sources, and that while we will always prefer peer review, because we, at least our authorizing legislation, really values a peer review, that preliminary data can be very helpful, and that there's a huge range from your first draft to your preprint to your final, and that we were working on doing a lot of education about that, at least in the education space.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. All right, so let's go ahead and open it up to audience questions. So if you still have any questions, I see we've got an active Q&A. Please continue to pop your questions in there. And I think Anita is gonna ask those of our panelists.
Yes, Ashley and I have been trying to pull things from the chat. So this is a little out of order, this first question, and it's two-parted. Coming from Sally Smith and Travis Nace, if you guys are still here. This question is for Erin, and this happened back when you were describing how you were advising your librarians to decide what recent articles to include. So Erin, excuse me, how did you describe your approach in a methodology section? And then Travis weighed in and said, and did the researchers want it removed? That's a problem we have, even with the shortest list of databases. So I think that's do you remember that point, but when you were describing that?
So yeah, so I think that this is where we have to acknowledge my privilege in the situation, that I'm the one who was the final person to sign off on the methodology section that the researchers were writing. So it had to get through our peer review office. It wasn't just what Erin says goes, but that the researchers, kind of the pushback that you would normally get, and the pushback you would get if you're writing a journal article, was not a factor, because I happen to oversee both parts. And so when we were talking about how we would write this up for our methodology, the way that we would write it was, we would say that we did the literature review. These are the sources. This is what we looked at. And then I would go back and we would say that this was a date that we last checked Eric. And that would be at that tail end. We would do a last check of anything in Eric as of that day. And so what the approach that we took that way was, we knew that there's never going to be one date in time that you may have it that a new publication doesn't come out that next day. And so that's why talking to scholars was really important, because we would know what's coming. And the other thing that we did in full transparency is that sometimes a major article came out that on an intervention I was reviewing, and I was not going to put out a press release saying this is our intervention report, which is our systematic review, and not include that new study. So you may stop and you may start again. So does that answer your question? And while I have this is related to a question in the chat. So I'm going to answer the questions that I see in the chat about, can I clarify what I mean about ingest every 6 months? So the way that the ERIC team works is not how most people think it works. We have an army of humans, had an army of humans who are amazing library professionals, who would go out and check all of the websites that we have agreed to index, gather all of their gray lit or journals in some cases, and manually add them, add all the metadata, index them, catalog them. They would update those records. So the ERIC team would do all of this. And because websites are only updated every so often, our agreement with these publishers, these gray-lit publishers, would be that we would go visit their website every 6 months. So we were going out every single day, but to cycle through our 1,000 or so publishers that we had this agreement, we would only get to you every 6 months. What you are seeing on the website now is that there is a backlog of records waiting to get published to the website. So you may not see those on the website today because the people who hit the buttons to publish aren't there. And the way that we were laid off, the people who were laid off who had to do this were ones who had no reason to believe that their jobs were in question, and that you couldn't permissions, your backup, and your backup's backup were all impacted at the same time with no notice. It is really hard to go through and get the permissions to publish on the website. I have every confidence that more records will go up on ERIC soon, and that it will all get fixed, and you will start to see content coming again. But the ERIC team every 6 months index records, each source every 6 months. But what you will see is daily or weekly batches going up on the website. That hasn't been happening right now due to some technical issues.
Thank you for that. Anita, do we have more?
There is one other question that I've seen in the chat, and people are sort of answering it too, but I guess we'll pitch this to our panelists. This is coming from Alex Hennigman. Does anyone have advice on searching for conference papers or proceedings across disciplines? There have been some people chiming in with answers, but I thought, and I've heard some of you guys on the panel respond here and there to this, but do you want to say anything more?
Well, I do like papers first and proceedings first from from OCLC. Another fantastic option is to actually ask the research team that you're working with if there are key conferences that should be included, and to search those and search the proceedings of those conferences specifically. And again, with gray literature, I really do like to have the idea of scope management techniques in place, because it can be very hard to stop searching. There is a database, I'll have to make sure it is still active, but I believe it was produced through uh, Walter Kluwer's Ovid. It's called Northern Lights, and it was very interesting because it actually gave you access to posters that sometimes can be very difficult to search. Google Scholar does have a very limited amount of conference papers in it, but like Google Scholar being the black box it is, sometimes you just don't know about the data saturation that you're getting. But I would say my preference, especially coming from Canada, where we, sometimes have a lot of niche conferences, would be to work with the research team and really ask them if they know, are there any key conferences that, that should be searched for relevant information.
Right, thanks so much for that. Anita, do we have more
There was a
questions?
really quick question to Erin. When was the last batch uploaded to ERIC database? Do you know? And I don't remember who asked that one on chat.
I don't know, but what I want to say in defense of the IS leadership who remains, there were a bunch of technical issues completely unrelated to the change of administration that caused issues ingesting, issues publishing. It was getting to be compliant with the new public access policy, adding these amazing new features to the website. We were doing some really, really cool things. which prevented us from publishing records. So just because they aren't on the website doesn't mean that they are not sitting there ready to go. And so, yeah, I would say I don't have a date offhand, but it was a while and it was annoying, but there were really, really good reasons. And in talking to the team who is still working, they are optimistic that they can publish again soon.
And just a quick comment to something, your suggestion about LinkedIn I was surprised, this is from the chat, was surprised by a suggestion to check LinkedIn. I mostly think of it as for business. Guess we should add that to Blue Sky, ResearchGate, academic, sorry, it cuts off.
Yeah. What I would say for Blue Sky, or for the differences that I've seen between Blue Sky and LinkedIn, is that if you are in the USAID or education research space, which is not necessarily all of you, or the library space, federal library space, there have been layoffs and you are immediately and unexpectedly cut off from all of your colleagues, where you probably don't have their personal cell phone numbers or email addresses, anything. So what is happening is that LinkedIn has become a way to connect, as these individuals who've worked together for 15, 20 years are now scattered. And they're continuing to do work and continuing to collaborate and continuing to have conversations and sharing their work once it's published. They're also sharing where they are working now or who they are working with now. So there's a lot of noise on LinkedIn, but knowing it is also really helpful to try to figure out okay, the person who was writing this paper used to be at organization X. They are no longer there. I wonder where they went and if they're still publishing. And I can find out more via LinkedIn than what they typically are posting on Blue Sky or any other network.
Another question that came in, is ResearchGate more trustworthy now than it was 10-ish years ago? That's from the chat. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, I would say that when you do a database search, like in PsycInfo or Medline or Embase, you still have to do a quality appraisal for the information you find in those databases for inclusion with a systematic review and a scoping review. So the same principles can be applied to a search that you would do in ResearchGate, whereas, you're locating the information, but when you identify a source that is on topic, you still have to do a quality appraisal, the same as we do with database research teams do with database results.
One thing I'll add.
Oh, go ahead.
Brian. I was just going to say that one thing I'll add is that sometimes it's useful to cross-validate that the article that's on ResearchGate is still in the peer-reviewed literature space, because oftentimes, I found that some articles have been retracted, but they remain on ResearchGate. And so it's useful to just assess whether or not the article still is out there.
Speaking of the What We're Learning House, would use ResearchGate a lot, but we would also just reach out to the authors for a copy of the paper. And so I think that if you have questions about, is it accurate, is it not? I have personally reached out to authors quite a bit, and especially in this world where the majority of my scholars are now looking for work, they don't have access to an email address that gives them library holdings and gives them subscription access. So there's a lot more emailing papers around. And I know that I have emailed several authors for a paper I'm working on, and I have gotten back immediately, as well as shared out a lot of my work.
Thank you. So I want to ask this question. I know we're real close to time, but there's a great question in the Q&A on what are your thoughts on using Internet Archive's Wayback Machine for gray literature searching?
Use it. I've worked with them. They have indexed all of Eric's stuff, and I've used it historically to try to figure out what is missing on government websites. And this is not a political statement, but every administration changes what's on the website and people make edits and changes, and there's days that you know that something was read differently. It is hard to cite, but it helps you know that this is what it at least used to say, and you can verify that this was the information that was there at a given point. The downside is you don't know why the change was made. You can speculate, but you have no idea if it was an editorial change or a retraction or what happened. But I find it at least very, very helpful to validate what used to be, or to find a paper that, for one reason or another, was not made widely available.
I totally agree. And I also just think there are like really pragmatic reasons why, like sometimes like a link is broken because people don't update their website, or they change their website and kind of forgot that a report was there. So there are lots of just like flukes like that Wayback is really useful for.
Yeah, and it is excellent also for that, especially if you're doing any research that has a bit of a historical context. For example, I'm involved with a project with where they're looking at how the definition of the term neurodivergency has changed over time, and we are definitely including that in our list of grey lit sources to search.
That's amazing. Does anyone have any tips on searching Wayback Machine now that we've all said that it's great, but it's also a little bit of a monster to search?
I would say scope management techniques. So not necessarily search every single term that you can think of. Search the ones that are the most prevalent in use. If you're looking for organizations, there's nothing wrong with having limiting it to a short list of the ones that would be the most likely to have the information. And then also domain limits are I find super helpful too.
Right. Thanks so much. I don't want to cut anybody off if there's other answers, but I do recognize that we are 1 minute over time. So I appreciate you so much. I am going to switch the slide. Please, everybody, and I'm sure there's been lots of love in the chat already, but join us in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much for being here for this hour. We also just want to let attendees know that we will be sending out that recording soon. And if you are interested, there is a social work librarian group, Google group. And this is especially, helpful, available for anyone who may not have funds to be an ACRL member to join that way. But there is a Google group available, and we would love for you to join us in our community of social work librarians there. And I believe, let's see if I've got another slide. That is the last slide. So thank you so much for coming. This has been an extremely valuable hour. And it was great to get the perspective of all of you. And like I said, we will send out that recording shortly. I don't know if any of you have anything that you would like to say in closing as well.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It was great to see such a great turnout. Thank you so much for being here.